in some cases, and then at some point, these things are going to fall down no matter what your intentions are.
Yeah.
I don't care if it's physical or virtual or in the cloud. It's still the same old crap.
Yeah.
The data in it doesn't get any less. So
No.
if it's already struggling today, a year from now, 2 years from now, there's a tipping point. It's usually it works, and then it's very quickly downhill.
Exactly.
It starts that at some point on your weekend index rebuild script, it doesn't finish anymore because it takes too long.
That's never happened to me.
There's 2 or 3 tables that the indexes are not rebuilt, not a problem. 6 months later, it's half the tables not rebuilt. Another year later, only the alphabetically first and second table get rebuilt. Everything's stuck for the rest of existence. Yeah, and then
I thought we didn't have to rebuild indexes anymore.
If you have a good storage system, yes.
What a
You're
coincidence!
Fired. Somebody kick him off the meeting.
I forget where Anthony works.
No, I still tell folks to do it.
Yeah, you don't have any orange on. I thought you might have a subtle orange background or something.
Okay, I don't know.
There's one orange book back there.
Yeah. So I'm curious about something, and obviously we'd have to redact vendor names. And I'm not going to say anything bad about them. But no, I'm curious, given who we've got gathered here, what is we've probably all come in behind a high availability solution that's been deployed that the customer was unhappy with, cost too much, didn't work, whatever. What is the worst one that you've had to go in and either repair or just burn down and say, listen, they just got it all wrong. I'm going to build this for you.
A 4-node 13 instance FCI. That was rough. So yeah, had to unwind that one.
I think I know which company that is because I think I know the person who was responsible for that.
It wasn't me, was it?
No.
I left it. It had maybe 4 instances. I came back a year later. I was like, wait, like these instances liked each other a lot. It made more instances, right?
So how did you get brought in there? Were they like, oh goodness, this is just unstable, whatever, we need somebody to come in and figure this out?
Yeah,
or what?
Basically, leadership was like, this thing's unmaintainable. We can't patch it anymore. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I can only imagine trying to do rolling windows on that. I imagine it's just the meme with the guy pointing and all the cards and lines. Like,
yeah. And we had to use Unicode letters for the drive letters because we ran out of regular letters. But
oh, right.
That's not supposed to work. Does that actually work?
No, it was mount points.
Just to say,
say that. I'm hoping
you're on the happy face drive.
I caught a 3-way availability group synchronous between North Carolina and Oklahoma City.
Oh.
And they wondered why it was slow. I had to explain to them the concepts of physics.
Did you explain synchronous?
I showed them the difference before and after, and they were happier afterwards. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, you wonder. Well, it's kind of going back to that though. You're talking about, not technology people, and then people are having this advanced technology sold to them. Like, how do you go in and set something like that up and walk away? Because somebody with the knowledge to do that probably knew it wasn't going to work.
Yeah, I don't think they knew. I did have one. It was hilarious. My write up to them on this started with a joke. It was, why did the availability group cross the road to slow down? They had 2 data centers across the road from each other, 2 different buildings. And they noticed that whenever they failed over an AG from replica A to B, it slowed down. Turns out it was the same storage array on the left side of the road with about 11 different hops on fiber to get across the road. So whenever they failed over, their latency, and it was a pure array, went from about 3/4 of a millisecond to about 12.
Because they were doing their IO over the network back to the source array.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
so I talked to customers about that a lot. That's actually not awful, because in that scenario, especially in an FCI, that was the AG specifically. In that scenario, you could have a failure of an array and restart the instance or fail over the actual instance when you want to, right? When it's more convenient for your business. And if you can take that latency hit for that period of time.
Yeah, they were in a state where they couldn't take that latency hit.
Yeah.
So they would fail over just for patching, and they always wondered why, but finally called me to double check it. It's like, well, there you are.
The funniest I came across, I think, is they had a regular cluster setup that you need for an AG, but then decided, AGs are no fun. Let's go with a clusterless AG on a cluster. And then wait for the cluster to fail over, and then start recovering. That's the only thing you're gonna do.
Well, it gets there's a similar one where it was that scenario plus I had a distributed AG on top of that for failover to another site because people up in management made some decisions, shall we say, that we had no control over, politics. And as a consultant, sometimes, you win some battles, you lose some battles. Sometimes they listen to you, sometimes they don't. And then at some point, things just become a mess. And it's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault in particular. It just, some things you do bandages to just get something working, and it just becomes a hard to manage solution. But I still hark back to be dead honest with you, the thing that got me into all this, kind of it is a sort of grandfathering all this, because I've been doing this probably longer than most people have even been in the industry at this point. But so the thing that got me into all this mess was there was a company here and they were having availability outages with SQL Server. This is back in the SQL 6.5 days. And to me, this is still one of the worst things because, it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Now, this is the days where, if you were down, you could put up a web page, it's like Web 1.0 almost, where like, hey, we're going to be down. Here's a 10% off coupon for our widgets. Like, come back tomorrow and we'll be fine. These days, in about a millisecond, somebody will be on Bing or Google or whatever their search engine of choice is, finding whatever it is they were looking to buy at 2 a.m. So this went on for a period of about 4 months. And they were just, out of their minds because they were blaming SQL Server because, default blame acceptor. And so I get in there, and of course, me being a late night person, I'm sitting in there knock at like 2 a.m, just trawling through event logs because, it's what I do. And I literally found where Compact Insight Manager, this is what dates it, was throwing up disk errors for months that were undetected because really what they were seeing was corruption. And when the application hit this bit, the whole thing blew up spectacularly. And they had log shipping set up, but they never tested it. So they would never fail over or do the role change to the other thing. So literally we'd have to wait for the rollback to happen. And it was hours every time. And of course, I brought up like, hey, has somebody noticed that the disk is basically, and that was the cause of their corruption. And it was just a whole series of events after that. That was just like the domino falling. And it took them the better part of 6 months to get stable. It was a lot of process stuff. But that was one of the ugliest things. Is it wasn't just somebody making a bad managerial architecture decision that you could sort of recover from or just blow up and quickly redo. This was literally 6 to 8 months of, first of all, figuring out what happened. Then, how do we fix it? They thought upgrading to SQL 7 would fix it. Nope. Because they didn't have the processes in place, so we had to put all that stuff in place. And then it became so restrictive because they had no change management to go, then went to really strict change management, so you could literally get nothing done. But it was also other silly things like we were there one night and they were trying to fix everything. And of course, when everybody's doing everything with chickens running around like where their heads cut off, they sent out this application to the web servers. And we're like, cool. Didn't work. So we literally asked the app team, so we need you to roll that back because it didn't work. And they looked at us like, what do you mean? Roll it back. like literally put it back to the version it was before because what you did didn't work. They're like, yeah, you can't do that. We're like, what do you mean? Like, yeah, we don't have an uninstaller. The only way to do it, and we don't know what files we touch. So literally the only way to get back was to flatten the box and reinstall everything. Oh, that wasn't even the tip. That it even gets worse from there. So then we said to them, okay, so can you provide us with the XE or the stuff to do that? They discovered in their source control, they were overwriting everything as they were making changes. They didn't version things. So it was like SQL Server was the tip of the iceberg. And once we started going through the whole thing, it's still arguably one of the worst environments I've ever worked in. And this is 20 years. And that's sort of what got me down this whole availability path. And so all the stuff I see today is very derivative of all those problems. It's like we're still fighting the same fires, just with different features, different technologies. It's people in process and people making stupid decisions oftentimes. It's not technology issues happen. Bad implementations are bad implementations. But when people make dumb choices, you can't expect good results. I don't know if that's everybody else's thing, but that's sort of where I'm at with most of this stuff these days.
Yeah. I'd say 99% of the problems that I see in the field with any sort of business continuity, just to narrow it down, it's people, process, organizational insanity. It's
You
rarely
mean 99.999%?
Yes.
Yeah.
Most
Well,
people,
and
most people,
go ahead.
most people start with the solution and not with
Yeah.
what do we actually want to achieve.
Yep.
They shop for a solution. Hopefully the one that costs nothing, works with a double click and does everything, but
Mhm.
we all know that doesn't exist.
Or
But
actually,
instead of
that's generous,
defining
Tom.
what do I actually need? What do I need in case of what's the bare minimum that my business needs to survive? And let's now try to make that go running, even if everything goes wrong. No, they're just like, oh, can we have one solution that does everything? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that just not working. Yeah?
And I would say that's generous, Thomas, because most people I talk to, that solution is at least they thought of something bigger. Like most people are like, I want an AG or I want an FCI. Okay, great. Why?
Yep.
Well, because I read it in this thing or my vendor told me I need this. Great. I still am asking you why. Like that's
Right.
like because I've had times, you know, now that I'm not consulting on a day-to-day basis and I've moved on, you know, where customers would, and I'd literally say to them, can you manage this thing? I don't think you can. You're going to break it in like 2 weeks. Sure enough, I get a call 2 weeks later, like, hey, you know that AG helped us put in? Yeah, it's broken. And it's like, I kind of was trying to set you up not to fail, but you went, this one, okay. And that's the thing as a consultant or somebody helping people, at some point you have to say, okay, if this is what you want, I will help you, but know that this is probably not in your best interests.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me is I think some of those decisions, those feelings go up and down the organization. I used to think it was just management, but when I started speaking on this stuff, I went from like 60 minutes of tech to 55 minutes of tech and 5 minutes talking about people, processes, things like that. And guarantee you every session I get a feedback slip or two. There's like, hey, it was fine. Skip the human stuff up front. We don't need that. I'm just here to learn tech. And that's the person that's going back to their manager saying, oh, I learned about always on AGs or whatever, and we need to implement those. And they tuned out that part. So their manager's not going to get that information. But really, that just made me commit to doing it more because it's reaching some people who need to go back to work and say, okay, yeah, the tech is cool, whatever. I learned some stuff about that, but here's some other stuff they talked about, training and processes and testing and all that we need to consider. But it drove me nuts the first couple of times because I was like, man, this is important. Because when I'm up here talking about all the times I broke it over the years, it was all human fails. The technology worked fine. We told it to do the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Yeah. For everybody on this call, at some point over the next 6 months, I'm going to reach out to you separately. You know, the whole comedians in cars getting coffee thing?
Yeah.
I now own itprostellingwarstories.com.
Oh,
It's like after the last couple of years, I know I could use a good laugh. Hopefully everybody else can. So at some point I want to record each of you and we can go as long as you want with all the goofy stuff you want to share. And my goal is literally 2-3 minute YouTube videos in a series for, a series, however we want to do it, but just you learn, but you laugh, and why not? So actually, so let's see. Peter joined. Peter, do you have any questions? Join for the hangout. Okay.
Yeah,
We'll
I'm
keep
just
going.
joining.
Too bad you have to ask something.
Yes, ask a question. Well, actually, I have a question for you. What if you can rattle it off? What's the most overcomplicated HA and or DR architecture you've ever seen in the wild?
I think Thomas and I will agree on the same one, but
We can talk about it.
exactly right.
Yeah, we nicknamed it the Kraken because it had 8 legs.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had to cut off at least 4 to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll defer to other people on this one because that one would be mine.
Yeah.
Okay, for the two
Still
of you,
there.
what's the second most crazy one you've seen?
Let's start with other people.
Okay.
Like Edwin's probably seen quite a few.
I gotta get unmuted. I'd like to withhold it. So I think I can talk about them since they've been a customer for quite a while. Their managed services, no, not my SaaS company had an 8-node cluster, 4 nodes on premises, 4 nodes on Azure. They had availability groups, but the guy who built the AG was a Windows guy who didn't understand how AGs work. Sort of. And they want to upgrade and not have any downtime, and they cannot upgrade their network connectivity between on-premises and Azure because it's too expensive, and now they're spending more. All of these things. I try not to talk about the tech because it's really not about the tech. That's the main problem. It's the processes and the people.
Boards to network. No, I'm not kidding. Like, so I spent the better part of 3 months with a customer once, literally diagnosing DNS issues. Like, once we would uncover one thing, we'd find something else. And this customer, for regulatory reasons, was mandated to fail over periodically. And that's where they started discovering these issues was, DNS wasn't getting updated. They found errant DNS servers that weren't even in use anymore, but were part of the architecture that were causing havoc. So it took us the better part of 3 months to just peel back the layers of the onion. And that was super complex because, again, to Edwin's point, it was not about AGs. It was not about SQL Server. It was about their infrastructure. Their processes weren't terrible. Like, this wasn't a process or an incompetent people thing because they had smart people there. But their networking was just wonky. So, but I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure most of the people on this Zoom call have seen it in the past 3 to 4 years. I'd say well over half, and that's not being a low number. It's probably super low number. I'd say close to 80% of the stuff I'm dealing with in clustered configurations is all networking issues these days. And it's frustrating because people think they know networking, but it's simple stuff like DNS, routing, how do I get from A to B? Like, it's not even that complex of stuff, but then they're like, I don't know why this isn't working.
Well, and the most kind of insidious bit of information that I've heard at customers off and on is, well, once we go to the cloud, we don't have to worry about that because it all happens for us. It's the opposite. But that's the problem when you come at it, like you said, you come at it from that angle. All right, we want a highly available setup. I'm provisioning something. I can move a slider and it's highly available. Done. But it really isn't. You've changed the field that you're playing on. You're still playing the same game.
But
or
it's a
very
whole,
similar game.
but it's a whole stack. Like,
Yeah.
so now with hyperconverged and whatever flavor of it you're using, or a lot of companies are using, people aren't considering the fact that you're on shared resources, and there's deduplication happening at the storage layer. Disclaimer, I work now for a storage company that does that, but you still need to take that into account in your architecture, where like you think you're redundant, which is what I've always called the illusion of availability. You think you've got all this stuff, but really it's literally just window dressing on stuff that's not really redundant underneath. And if you don't understand what you have, at some point you made a whole lot of assumptions that are completely false. And when you go to fail over or something happens, it's like, well, what happened? Like somebody needs to sit down and look at their infrastructure, because like we had one customer, and we've had a few customers using Nutanix, so I'm going to be very sort of generic here over the years. And they have some technology in there that's very cool, but if you're using an AG, it basically means you're almost doubling or tripling your storage the way Nutanix works. And they were wondering why their storage was getting eaten up. And it's like, well, the AG works the way it does, and you've now got N copies of your data across the replicas, and you've also now got Nutanix adding to that complexity. And they're like, oh, we didn't think about it that way. I'm like, it's your platform. You need to understand what you're implementing.
I make a living helping people sift through the layers underneath the data, and I can comfortably tell you 7 out of 10 companies get it wrong. They have a data professional that knows the data layer. They have an infrastructure person that thinks they know the infrastructure. They don't talk. They don't understand the nuances of the other layers, and they get it so wrong that it's so flawed. It's not even funny.
Well, they do talk on Slack.
The larger a company gets, the more you have to be careful that one corner in the company makes a change. So something I came across is DNS seems to be harmless and hard to mess up unless you put your DNS servers behind a load balancer, and then you have Windows clustering updating DNS. And the first half of the update statement goes to one DNS server, and the second half goes to the other one because we're load balancing. And then the two DNS servers try to reconcile and come up with, oh, let's go back to the original setting because that's what we agree on. Everything else we don't. And you have a failover and you're still in the old place. That took a while to figure out because you don't know. You see 2 IP addresses in your configuration, and there's a DNS server answering there. But then one time you query it, and then you query it again, and you get a different answer. And like, why is this DNS changing like on the fly? Yeah, so just one more thing to check in the future on the checklist of things that shouldn't be there. But yeah, no, this is things that can happen all the time, and that's not anybody's fault. The team that implemented that solved the problem that 2 DNS server became overwhelmed, so they replaced it with 4 and put a load balance in front of 2 pairs. Yeah, not a bad idea, unless you don't check with the other team that uses clustering and can't help them. Yeah? So was easy to fix once it was found, but interesting.
So here's something I'm curious about from the brain trust. I know, like in a lot of my sessions I give on this, I always kind of generically encourage people to, go outside of the comfort zone of their team. If you're a DBA sitting in my session, talk to your network people, talk to your storage people, all the stuff you've kind of just talked about. In medium to large firms where that's difficult, you're not going down the hall, or you can't just fire up a Teams call with the group that runs that. What, for the people that have operated a lot in organizations that size, what's the best kind of setup to bring those teams together that you've seen? I don't love the concept of like a center of excellence, but I'm wondering if any of you have ever seen something like that or something much better around HA stuff.
Well,
Pizza and beer.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, you're not wrong there, Tim, but sorry to
yeah.
cut you off, David. I would say be intentional, and instead of thinking team to team, start by thinking one individual to another individual. Break the wall, start to put the window in. Don't just break down, don't have a goal of destroying the whole wall.
Yeah. No, that's great. The issue I've seen is sometimes at large firms, you may like get along personally, but they'll say like, listen, I don't have time to sit down and, war game anything with you because I'm resourced to all this other stuff. And I guess I'm wondering how to break through the organizational barriers that are there. It's like, the data people, we don't have time for them. Or the storage
That's
people,
where the
we don't have
pizza
time
beer
for
comes
them.
in.
In a big organization, you always need buy-in from the very top. If the very top is not interested in really doing something, you're fighting windmills. You will never succeed. Yeah. But once you have buy-in, what I've seen working in the past was to basically, like, most corporations have these projects to get some business case solved. And high availability is just another business case where you need a project manager, someone whose job it is to run to the 15 different teams and get them on board. If you just walk up to another team and you don't have the authority to make them do something, it's based on, hey, is this a good friend? And you call in a favor, but that will not get you to the result line. But you need to treat it as any other business function that gets delivered. Then you might have a chance. I'm not saying it's going to succeed, but that thing is, yeah. And again, no buy-in on the top. Nobody's going to spend that money. Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, nobody wants to pay for backups till they need it. Yeah, and then it's too late if you don't have them.
Yeah.
And to Thomas's point, just like any other business function, you just have to keep your eye out on a project, big or small. The bigger the project, of course, the bigger the impact, which means the bigger the coverage. So, for instance, if you have somebody who's a sponsor and they're undertaking a much bigger project, that's an opportunity to understand who are the people involved, which teams are involved, and then start talking to whoever's leading that. And Thomas is right. Project manager typically is the person, but you can start talking to the people who will be part of that, because you now have the opportunity as part of the bigger project to start talking to them and just try to understand where they're coming from. But it does take a lot of proactive reaching out to in order for just to get the ball rolling. And once people start seeing that it is happening, they'll see the value. But I kind of look at it as a selling idea, where you're selling the idea that, hey, we need to talk together, find an opportunity since we're all working on this project. Because once it's now in operations, well, forget about it, right? Everybody's taken care of.
Keep going. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Another trick that I used before is tacking it on a regular business project. So business wants something new, like, okay, we were selling a business that was brick and mortar shop. So they needed to be 9 to 5 and the cash registers needed to work. Yeah. And then a few more hours for making the deliveries and all that stuff to get the shops filled up. Now they want to go online and sell 24/7. So that's a great project to get high availability in, because the business will probably be say, oh yeah, we want to sell on the website all year long, every hour of the day. Then you can make it as part of that project or a sub project there if you don't have the direct buy-in. But then you can get it done, and then you just sneak in all the other machines that are not part of that business part and make them go the same way. No, the hard part is usually figuring out how to do it. Once you set it up, then rinse and repeat for another server, for another website, for another database is not that hard. It's the first one to get it actually working in a stable way. Then rinse and repeat is easy.
Part of the packages that we do with our business is platform health checks. So database and down, and we'll get everybody together to sync up and literally, infrastructure, VM, cloud, data, storage, networking, and then go through the platform end to end. And I always put people on the spot at every different layer. And that way each member of an IT silo starts to see the perspective of the other people in the other silos. And after a while, they start talking. And usually at the end of a week of that kind of review, we have a lot of fun, and people start to want to work together more closely. And they start to understand that, hey, maybe these applications have interesting needs that we didn't know about. And they start opening their mind a little bit. It's a lot of fun.
I'm going to take a different approach because that's all greenfield and new and shiny and happy. What I find usually affects change is an outage. Because when you're going greenfield, we could talk about the best way to approach a project. But when the crapola hits the fan and you're down and you see where you're exposed and your gaps are, I can tell you from doing this for nearly 25 years, that is when change starts to happen, and it happens fairly quickly because they do not want to see that again. Now, that's not 100%. Like, there are exceptions to that rule. But that tends to affect change more so than the greenfield, because when you're architecting availability into something, it's an insurance policy. Like, you hope you never have to break glass in case of emergency, so it just kind of sits there. That's why we had the problem with 2-node 1-instance FCIs in like 2005, 2006. Everybody had a million of them, and they all this extra compute sitting there not being used, right? Then, we've seen different evolutions of that, but when you're down for any significant amount of time, or even if it's not a significant amount of time, but it had a severe impact on the business and its bottom line, there's going to be change, period. And that, to me, is a great opportunity to say, okay, we're screwed up. Like, let's have a rational conversation so this doesn't happen again. And to Thomas's point, like, maybe and Edwin's as well, we get better this time, but it's going to be an evolution over time. We need to get here today, but where do we want to be in a year? Use it as a catalyst. Like, we felt the pain. We see that we're not communicating. How do we fix all this? We know it's not changing tomorrow. But what do we now put in place to make sure this doesn't happen again? And I know that's a really bad way to think about it, but I find calm can come out of chaos if everybody has the right mindset. It's ugly, but it works.
Most businesses aren't in the model of being proactive. So it takes an outage to encourage them to be more proactive, to prevent a reactionary response when it fails again, which stinks, but it's the way it is.
Yeah,
and
I'd be curious for some people on this call, especially those of us that are or were consultants that have touched customers, like, where you've seen that in action, or things like it, because it's like people don't want to believe, or management doesn't want to believe, and then when it happens, like, you never want to say, I told you so. That's always like a bad thing to do, but you're thinking it in your head. Like, you're just like,
oh, my US Thanksgiving got wrecked this year. A year and a half ago, I did a health check for somebody, and I straight up told them, you need to be thinking about offsite immutable backups. You need to be able to test this. Oh, we're working on it. We're working on it. They didn't. Got hit by ransomware. Took them down. They were down 3.5 weeks.
Oof.
Yeah. And the only thing that they could do, they actually paid the ransom, and they had a database backup that they stole that was 2 weeks old at the time. So they lost 2 weeks worth of data. Business was down about 3.5 weeks, still picking up the pieces to this day. And it was bad. And I told them, you need better backups. You need a proven solution that is going to work. We're working on it. You know how that goes.
It doesn't count when you're an actual employee, though, when you tell them so and they don't listen to you.
It should count.
It should.
He said consultant, so I'm just asking because I've never been a consultant.
No. Everybody, because here's the funny thing though that I find, and Tracy, you can confirm or deny. Like, oftentimes when I've gone in as a consultant, we'll say the same things that the on-staff DBAs are saying, but they've tuned you out, right?
Yes.
And it annoys me because I'm like, you're right. Like, you're saying the right stuff. I don't know why we're coming in, but okay. Like, do you see that? Do you see that, Tracy?
Yeah, I've had consultants come in and literally just come up to me and ask me what I've been saying, and then I save them a couple of days worth of work.
Yeah.
And hand them stuff, and they write the reports up, and they're like, I don't know why they had me come in. But sometimes at one company it worked out to my advantage because the operations people didn't like me, and they wouldn't tell me how my servers were configured on the back end. Like they wouldn't tell me what RAID levels the disk were back when we had spinning disk. So the only way for me to find out was through the consultant. So I found out like my transaction log files were the ones on RAID 5 and everything was not the way it was supposed to be. But the only way for me to figure out how my servers were configured was through the consultant because they wouldn't tell me.
Yeah.
Which was just, I was working in a poisonous company, but.
I wish I was making this up, that on a gig I had a few years ago, one of the developers literally walked up to me, said, here's a KB article. We're wondering if you could email the DBA team and ask them to apply this cumulative update, which is referenced in the article, to fix it. It's like, okay, great. I mean, you've made my job really, really easy, but why don't you just send the email? And he actually said, because they won't listen to me, they'll listen to you. And I won't pick up the phone when that company calls back again.
I've done it at one company, like they wouldn't listen to me, but they would listen to someone else. So I would funnel everything through the other person. That's how I got things done.
There's a bullet point I have on slides in a couple of my talks that just says, if you're paying people for their advice, take it. And it's the closest I've ever gotten to like an amen in church in a technical session. But a lot of people are like, well, what if you're a full-time employee? It's like, I didn't differentiate there. If you're paying somebody for their expertise, take it. So if you, and yeah, I've walked into a bunch of places, and the CIO or whatever will pull you aside, like, how's my team? Oh, your team's great. You should do everything that they say. I'm going to repeat everything they've said in what I told you. And they're like, really? Why did we bring you here? I don't know. You have an excellent team. But yeah, there's so many, and I've worked at places like this too, where there's an instant distrust if they work for you. And it boggles my mind. I've because I've had people like, well, can you explain that? I was like, well, I can tell you how to fight against it. I can't explain it because it's never made any sense to me, whether I saw it or whether it was happening to me.
I think it just goes back to human behavior. And this is something that I've learned 3 years on. I've been doing this for the past 3 years, where I have been focusing on human psychology when companies would bring me into consulting projects and just understand the different people that are working for different teams. I had a customer from a couple of years back where they brought me in to fix an AG issue. And I insisted, I want to be in your office, talk to your team. Like, why can't you do everything remote? I just sense that there's something off here. Got there 30 minutes in, I realized the network guys were not talking to the DBAs. The DBAs were not talking to the developers. The developers were not talking to the infrastructure guys. So it really is all about human interaction and human psychology. And you kind of wonder, wait, the DBAs are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. How come they're not selling the idea? The thing is, it's all about them being so overly familiar with the people around them that they think, what advice? I'll just rely on this guy who I've never talked to in the past and just trust them. And because they're paying big bucks to bring in somebody with a fresh, totally different perspective, even if it's saying the same thing, they would value it more. And it's just human nature. And we try to explain it in more technical terms, but the reality is we're still humans interacting with fellow humans. We're just implementing technology the way technology should be implemented.
Yeah, I once spent 45 minutes convincing a director that a database was corrupt and I needed a backup off of a tape to restore it. But I wouldn't have needed it off a tape if she hadn't made me write batch files to do a delete off the disk before we wrote a good backup. But 45 minutes of trying to convince her. And then I convinced her. She let everybody hang up off the call. And then she called me back privately and was telling me I used the word corrupt a lot, just in general, I guess. I don't know when I was using the word corrupt a lot. And then she denied that she ever told me to write these batch files to delete the backups beforehand, which I guess I just randomly decided to do this bad practice. So, but I spent forever doing this, and it took 7 hours for them to get this 3/4 of a gig database back. It was our MSDB and all our jobs that controlled stuff, weren't running, and
I
we had
have
a
a name
severe
for this
outage. But 45 minutes to convince. So I ran check. I did the DPC page. There's no data, but to her that didn't mean anything. But like literally, how could you? How do I use the word corrupt a lot? I mean,
I would start using it more, just like Morehouse just said. Go ahead, TJ.
I mean,
No, I have a name for this. I call it that decisions are made based on feelings, not on facts. So just one other. It happens a lot. It's I'm not saying that a manager needs to be a subject matter expert, but he needs to be able to trust his subject matter experts and the facts they present, and not then make a decision based on feelings he has towards either the people or the technology or the vendor. Yeah, you see it more and more often that decisions are made based on we don't like that vendor. Yeah, and we've all seen that certain vendors have very bad reputation and others have good one. Yeah?
This whole
to piggyback on
conversation-
Alan, to piggyback on what Alan said, and just Thomas reiterating, one of the reasons why there's much more happening when an outage occurs is because there's that feeling of fear. We don't want this to happen again. And so it creates that sense of let's do something about it now. There's the fear, and the emotion of fear is what drives them to make decisions versus, we're trying to prevent something from happening in the first place versus now, it already happened. Let's not repeat the same mistake again. So yeah, you're right. It's whether we like it or not, people are still making decisions based on emotions, but we come in and show them the right path and making it more based on the technology and the rationale behind why we're doing what we're doing. Yes, Tim.
Oh, it's just the conversation reminded me of like the whole not really trusting or having the confidence in our existing staff. We need to hire a consultant. Just the oddity of companies not realizing. One, it's like, well, why aren't you hiring really, really smart people? But it goes back to that mindset of managers afraid to send their people to training for fear that they'll become better and get a better job. In that little cartoon about, well, what if we don't send them to training and they stay here? It's like, do you want that undertrained staff, but you want them performing at the principal consultant level, but yet you don't want to make that investment in the people, just like you're not making the investment in the technology. It's a weird world that we live in, but kind of thankfully we do, because most of us are consultants.
Well, the funny thing about that, it's a joke that I think a lot of us know or have heard, which is you can have 20 years of experience, but it could be the same year of experience 20 times, right? Like, it's kind of what it is in that case. But I think the other thing underlying all this, which we haven't talked about, and I'd be interested in everybody's perspective, because there are some vendors on the call, there are some people who are consultants, people who are FTEs, how cost factors into this, because I think once you kind of get like bean counters involved, I kind of hate that word, but it's kind of true. Like, people are looking at a bottom line, and I understand their budgets, and I understand that matters. Let me be very clear. As a consultant and now as somebody who works for a company, I totally get that budgets are a thing and people only have so much money to spend and all that good stuff. But the problem is as we're seeing with like the outages to the airline industry recently, at some point you need to spend money to be able to save your business. At some point you're going to be out of business because you weren't at all proactive about your stuff. And that tech debt, and I did and I've done multiple blogs on this, I talk about this all the time, catches up to you, and it's so expensive to fix, you can't afford to fix it. So you're in that literally damned if you do, damned if you don't position. So I'd be curious as to everybody in the call, because everybody brings a different perspective. We all know this is eventually going to cause an availability outage. That's not the thing. It's how do you as a consultant, as an FTE, as a vendor, handle this, because it's all different sides of the same coin, really.
Well, I think one of the things that I've heard in my career as an FTE time and time again, multiple companies, is IT is a cost center. It costs us money. It costs us money. Nobody ever sees it as we depend on this to run our company. And yes, we're not bringing in a profit, but going back to David's experience over Christmas or Thanksgiving rather, if you didn't spend that money on having those backups safe from ransomware, how much are you now losing because you didn't invest? Right. It's not about it's not, we need to look at it as, no, you're not making money off of IT, but we're going to prevent you from losing money or losing revenue or things like that. The other thing that, we talk about budgets as far as dollars, but for me, one of the biggest challenges that I have is the time budget. There's only so many hours in the day, and there's so many things that need to get done. If you don't have enough people, something has to give. What are you going to give up? Is it going to be shoring up your HADR story? Is it going to be improving the efficiency of this other process? It's going to be putting in this new system or this new feature that your sales department sold, and now you have to actually build because they didn't tell you until after they signed the paperwork. And guess which one usually wins? So, I mean, so it's as much the time budget for that I've felt constrained by as it is anything else over the past 5 to 10 years.
I hear you on both of those points, Andy. From a time budget perspective, there's only so much time I'm willing to work during the week. From a mental health perspective, for a relationship with my family perspective, my family and my mental health are more important than my job. Somebody will hire me to do something, put food on my table. I stop working where I'm at now because they don't like that. And also, to your, IT is a sunk cost budget. I always found it interesting with a large financial institution that I used to work for, that we were, you're sunk cost, but there were 3 different levels of priority 1 page out based on how much money per hour the IT outage was costing. And there are some people on this call who can speak to that from a financial, or could, if they were allowed, speak to that from a financial institution perspective.
I once in my life worked for a company that actually defined how much a minute of outage would cost. And that made it so easy to make a decision if some complex HA solution made sense or not. Yeah, you're losing X amount of dollars per minute. This solution saves you that many minutes on average per year. Is it worth it or not? That makes it a simple solution. Most companies can't tell you how much they lose. And honestly, I worked for other companies where it was like, okay, even if we're down for 2 hours, it doesn't affect our business because people are just doing twice as much 2 hours from now. Right? So I'm sure that's not the case. Yeah. For each and every business, because another business, I want to buy groceries now. The site is down, I go to the next one, or I want to have some food delivered. Yeah, it's not site down, I go to the next one. Yeah, but if most businesses that do like regular stuff and are not like in the top ones and the super websites that need to run all the time, if you sell regular stuff, your customer will come back 2 hours from now. So you don't need a solution that is, you just need something reasonable. If you're down for 3 weeks because you can't find your backups, that's a different story. Yeah. But back to the thing, when you know how much business you lose for every minute you're down, then it's very easy to make a decision how much you invest into that. But which company does the work of actually figuring that out?
Not many.
Yeah, I've been saying that for the better part of, again, 20 some years of what's the actual cost of downtime. Like, and there's also, to the point made earlier, there's a human cost because you can burn people out. And what do you lose when the person who knows your systems the best, or even if it's just your database systems and SQL Server, when they walk out the door, that knowledge that walks out the door, the institutional knowledge of those systems that may or may not be documented, because when did they have time to document it? Because they were, working 24/7. That's when it gets real, because people trying to pick up the pieces after that, they're like, how did they even do this? I don't even know where that lived, or like, I don't know what this does. And then that's where you get into those systems that nobody wants to touch, because it's like, all right, this thing did this thing, and we know if we look at it sideways, it's going to go down, so I'm not touching it, right? And you get it's this chicken and egg kind of a thing. Like, if you treat your people well and don't burn them out, and I think we've all experienced that, where you're on the treadmill and you're either on call, or you're up at 2 a.m. helping a customer out of a bad situation, and then at some point you just need to sleep and eat. Literally, like, forget quality of life. It's just, I need to sleep and I need to eat. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. And I know I can't do those hours like I used to anymore, because, I could do it. Just the backlash of it on my health is not worth it to me anymore. I've done, and I still do every now and then, 24 to 48 hour days. I'm hoping that is not the case much anymore, but I've done it. But when I was younger, I would bounce back from that pretty quickly. Now that I'm, shall we say, a little bit older, I don't bounce back as quickly from those. So yeah, I think that's the hidden cost of all these availability outages, when you have to do these 24/7 exercises that are, I mean, look, it's going to happen. It's just, at some point, people are going to give you the middle finger and say, I'm out.
I think Rick actually has a technical question for everybody here. Yeah, go for it, Rick.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm not even sure how to frame it, because it's almost more of a, has anyone else seen this, like, a lot kind of thing. And some of you have heard me talk about this before. So a few of us have been involved in kind of a rash of incidents where clients have an availability group. They go through and they're doing, say, Windows patching on the secondary. Usually either a security patch or something like a VMware tools patch that does kind of muck around with the networking. And then when they reboot the secondary, the AG goes down for a while until that secondary comes back online. I've kind of got a repro of it I've been playing with in the lab, although I haven't gotten it scripted out to the point where I can, like, release it and blog it and have, be able to break AGs on command. Although it's kind of cool to think about, like Rick's AG killer script. It seems to have something to do with ending up in a situation where the cluster nodes cannot talk to each other, but can still communicate with the file share witness. Incidentally, yeah, and here we're talking about usually 2 node AGs with 1 FSW. But just have other folks been seeing this, like, a lot lately, or is it just?
Yeah, so I'll say yes to that, because I've helped a lot of customers out of this situation. Let me just, are you running standard edition going over 2 different sites, or is this single site?
Enterprise. It's always enterprise when I see it.
Single site too.
There are a lot of factors. For example, just in SQL Server from 2017 on, and now that they've brought it more into the Windows side because it was a Linux thing, like RSSTC, so required secondary, whatever that thing is, to basically, you're telling SQL Server, if this thing is in a state, don't let the primary come up, until it. So that's a thing. So you might want to check that depending what version of SQL Server. But I find that when you see network stuff like that, and if it's frequent, you have just serious underlying network issues, and you're getting blips, and it doesn't matter. And then we get into things like, where are your core cluster resources located? I can't tell you how many times. Actually, I think it's every customer. when it up until the time I stopped doing consulting, where it's like, especially in DR situations, like where they're not keeping track of where the core cluster resources are. And not that I'm going to go deep into quorum here, but the only thing that keeps a copy of the cluster database, which is the cluster configuration, is a disk witness. Basically the file share witness is the arbiter, but it knows who owns the core cluster resources, which at that point would be the master of the cluster, if you will, right? And
Yeah.
that's the definitive source of what the cluster configuration is. And if you ever see in the cluster log where something goes down, but the cluster group tried to come up on another node and it says partition in time, it
Yeah.
basically is saying, I don't have the latest copy of the cluster configuration, so I'm not going to allow the cluster to come up here.
Yeah, so
And
sorry to break in, but here's the really interesting thing about this.
yep.
So the reason I'm bringing this up again, because we talked about this a few months ago, I think. I had convinced myself that, because every place I'd seen it before was like you're saying, the cluster host was on the wrong node that happened to be on the node that they're rebooting, and that's why they lost quorum. So I convinced myself that it was all about cluster hosts. Actually started rolling out agent jobs to periodically check where the cluster host was and push it over to the primary if it wasn't already there on the primary. And then a couple of weeks ago, the reason I'm digging into this again, a couple of weeks ago, we've only seen it once in this situation. We actually did have primary node, cluster host, secondary node that's getting patched, and the same issue happened. When I was digging through the cluster logs afterwards, I could actually see where it lost quorum because the secondary node was still able to get to the file share witness, even though it was not the cluster host, updated the geometry on the file share witness, which of course just means it's a different revision because, as you say, the entire architecture isn't stored there, and the primary went offline. It's like, oh, crud. So even the cluster host isn't really necessarily making this bulletproof.
No, it's not. And so, see, that's the whole thing. Clusters are not the panacea. And people make a lot of these assumptions that I think I just wrote a blog post about that. But actually, the reality of this is clusters protect you until they don't, right?
Yeah.
And to me, this says if you're seeing these blips, like for example, we saw with one customer in Azure, where things were architected fine, but Microsoft, as it turns out, on the back, long story short, we had an AG blip, things failed over, and we were like, what the heck is going on? And from a cluster perspective, we could see, I was going through the logs, we could see here's where the blip happened. But then we also looked at perfmon and we saw where the nodes lost connectivity, but there's no good reason for it. Turns out, long story short, Microsoft was doing host maintenance and they were moving things around, and that's supposed to be transparent, but it's not totally. And because clusters are very sensitive beasts when it comes to networking, you screw with the cluster and something happens, it's going to affect the AG or an FCI, but in your case, it would be an AG. So what we had to do is change some thresholds, like, same subnet threshold, and that kind of stuff, to be more tolerant of when this blip might happen, because we couldn't predict it. It could happen at 1 PM. It could happen at 3 AM. We didn't know. And we might not see, and we went through a period of not seeing it for 6 months, and then it happened straight for 3 weeks. So I would look at things like that, because I don't know where these AGs are located that you're seeing this, but if it's in a cloud provider, it might be something like this. Or if it's host maintenance on VMware or something like that, there are probably some thresholds and settings you could tweak.
Yeah, it's always that. It's like always on-prem VMware when I see this where it's a problem. And there's usually situations where we've relaxed those timeouts.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you're talking about a synchronous AG, if you relax it to the point where it's not going to get dinked by a VMware Tools upgrade, like it suddenly will time out if you lose a node. So yeah, I guess in 2022, I was like, before you do the VMware Tools update, check where your cluster host is and be sure it's on the primary if you're going to be doing your secondary. And I'm almost feeling now like it has to be more like, if you're going to do a VMware Tools update, or if you're going to do like a SEP endpoint update or something like that, kill your cluster host service first, which seems extreme, but that's kind of almost where I'm landing on this. Like for the people who see it. That's the other weird thing is it seems like some sites will see it every patching cycle, as others never run into it.
Yeah. I mean, I saw another weird one where a customer had an old switch in the mix that was causing problems. Because there would be like broadcast messages coming out, and that old switch, the way it handled it, would just flood the traffic, and it would cause FCI failures. but it didn't affect anything else. It was just physical FCIs in their environment, like on physical hosts. And they traced it down to just 1 or 2 old switches in their environment that they were ultimately going to be upgrading anyway. But so they just decided to live with it. But because we were like, yeah, the cluster, like the Windows is fine, the cluster seems okay, like this is something external. So what I'm hearing, and I'd love to hear like Edwin and John, because I know you guys have done a lot of troubleshooting, and you know, Thomas and anybody else, but this seems like external to me, and it's a matter of figuring out what that thing is that's causing this. And it can't just be patching. Patching alone is a sort of innocuous thing. It's a combination of 2 or 3 things that in sequence are causing this.
Yeah, so digging deeper, I can't, you know, it's too hard to reproduce by, you know, doing patches on demand. In a lab, the way I can kind of repro it is so there's a hidden network involved with the cluster. So you have your, you know, physical, I know it's virtual, but called physical network adapter.
Yeah.
And the behind the scenes, there's like another virtual network adapter that's, you know, kind of earmarked for cluster communication. So if I go through and I kill that cluster network on the secondary node, but leave the physical network up and running so I can hit the file share, I can get this to happen pretty often on demand. So my theory is when we see this with the VMware tools updates, it has something to do with sequentially messing with the adapters that's triggering it.
So here's part of the problem. So in a cluster, the public network, if you will, also is the cluster network as well. It's not only just, and that's what it uses first. That's why kind of in VMware, especially because everything's sort of combined underneath, the general recommendation is only have a single NIC. The 2 NICs gets you past the validation thing that Microsoft should change, but let's not go there. The problem is people think having that second VNIC buys you something, when in reality, in most, but not all cases, it doesn't. So you having the 2 NICs might be complicating the situation.
Oh, so there's actually aren't 2 NIC boxes. I'm talking about the, and I feel I'm blanking the name and I don't have my virtual up right now to check, but in any failover cluster situation, there's a virtual network adapter that's used for communication between the cluster nodes.
No.
This is the same physical
private
NIC,
private cluster network. It's not a heartbeat network.
No. Yeah.
You don't need that. That's what I'm talking about. That's old best practices from physical days. If you have a physical server, but generally in virtual, the recommendation, unless you literally underneath have a completely separate network that you only have a single VNIC for all cluster configurations because that one does both. And all your bandwidth and redundancy tends to be underneath there at the virtualization layer. Having the 2 VNICs to have the public and cluster as well as the private network doesn't buy you much. And as you're seeing, it might complicate your...
I know this environment that Rick's talking about. There's 1 network adapter assigned to the virtual machine. 1 and only 1.
It's not a separate VNIC. There actually is like a secret squirrel.
It's a separate
shadow network created by the
shadow
clustering
interface, but not a separate VNIC.
Okay.
And I would look up the name for you because you can only find it if you do like, you know, get net adapter dash show hidden.
Don't ever touch that. So that's a cluster network driver.
Yeah.
Oh God.
But here's my theory. When these bad things happen to the cluster, I think it's because the security update you're running is messing with that network that I would never ever mess with under normal circumstances.
So that's literally the cluster network driver.
Yeah.
It shows up as a NIC or basically don't ever.
Yeah,
that's bad mojo.
So the only reason I'm messing with it is because I'm trying to reproduce this weird issue, and that's the only way I can find to do it on demand. So I think that's what the security software updates are doing behind the scenes. Which is kind of why I'm almost at the level of like just kill the failover cluster service before you patch on the secondary.
But but let's define security here. Is this like antivirus? Is this
routine Windows updates?
Usually a VMware tools update is involved.
Oh, that would make sense then, because usually the VNIC, the VMXNet 3 driver inside the guest is updated, and that virtual cluster adapter, if you will, which is the network driver, is bound to that NIC. So that would make sense to me, although I've never seen that cause that much pain in a customer environment.
Yeah, it's weird. Seemingly identical hardware setups, different clients. Some people see it routinely, other people never see it. This is strange.
And this particular site that Rick is talking about, we see it more times than we don't, which is really weird.
That means that says to me there's a configuration setting somewhere that somebody missed, probably, because, but off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what it is. But it feels like a configuration error to me, or a missed configuration. I don't say error. Error is a very strong word that I want to back away from. Like something was missed, not intentionally. That's different in this environment. That might be a default for that environment because they think it's more secure or something. That isn't set. Could be a group policy. I don't know. Like that's what it kind of feels like to me. Because I think I would have seen this a lot, or again, a lot of the other consultants on this call who use VMware and clusters would see more often if this was a really common scenario.
Yeah, it's definitely not common.
That's what's strange about this, because it feels like if this is bothering me enough that I'm researching it and trying to reproduce it, saying like try to figure out how to work around it more effectively. Like it's weird that there's not more buzz about it.
So I'll ask Dumb Allen question. Have you done anything like trying to set quas on the VNICs just to guarantee it network bandwidth? Like, so to see if that makes any difference, like in this.
We haven't tried that, but I know the back end of this thing, and it's all 10 gig. It's all good equipment. These guys don't overcomplicate anything. Not to say they haven't done anything wrong, but I don't think bandwidth is a challenge there. They may have some other stuff going on.
Okay,
but it's running pretty light when they do.
And the hosts are not overloaded, so there wouldn't be any noisy neighbor, like somebody's stealing my network, kind of stuff.
No, they run so undercommitted. It's not even funny.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you dig through the cluster log, you can actually see when they're losing quorum reports that the nodes have lost communication with each other, but they got the file share witness geometry right.
So I'm going to ask again another dumb Allen question.
These aren't dumb. Ask away.
For any other VMs sitting on that host, do they lose connectivity?
Nope.
Okay.
That's not a dumb question. That's a good question.
Because this is where I've seen clusters are super sensitive. That means there is a network blip, but standalones are just withstand that because the tolerance doesn't matter. So then it's figuring out, is it this update? Is it something that comes along periodically at the network layer? That, because this is how we found the Microsoft thing in Azure. Like, we're like, okay, like we've vetted this configuration. We helped put it in. We know we're not dumb. Like, so let's just tear it back. And we're like, okay, this has to be external. And then we started looking at perfmon, and then it showed up. Like, it was just okay. And that could be the other thing here. It might be the patching thing, but there could be some transient network thing happening. This is how we found the switch thing for the FCI that touches nothing else. Just this one configuration is so sensitive to whatever that happens. So I would see if anybody potentially is either pushing stuff across the network at that point or other things, because that's how we found these things. And it's very telling to me that it's not happening to any other system but these. Because if it was a wider, more affected thing, then it would touch everything. So the fact that it's here, and I know clusters are super sensitive, and I've seen similar things, said that some transient network things happening that happens just long enough that it affects the cluster. I could be wrong, but that's more what this is feeling like, because I've seen this in different but not the same situations.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think the challenge with tracking this stuff down is if it was an issue with like at the VM level. Like if it's an issue with just the virtual network adapter going down completely, they'd be fine because they wouldn't be able to get the file share witness, and you're not going to see other node that it was that it had an outdated geometry.
Do you have network logs from around those times to see if anything else was happening?
We don't, but they are tracking that, and I'll ask them. We have another patching window because it's a mutual client of ours. We're doing another patching window in 2.5 weeks, I believe.
Okay.
So I'll make sure they've got all that enabled and cranked up for when we go do that.
I could be totally off base on this, but this is how we've tracked stuff down. It's like, okay, it's only happening on these two systems. It seems to be network related. Let's see what's happening underneath. And if somebody's pushing something at that time, or it's just 2 milliseconds long enough for the cluster to be tripped up, it sucks. It absolutely positively sucks when stuff like that happens.
It's a needle in a haystack, yeah.
Yeah, and again, that's what my gut's kind of saying about this, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Because just patching shouldn't do that. Like if you just patch like the secondary node would say VMware tools and you reboot it, it's going to be out of the cluster, but who cares for like 30 seconds? That's normal.
Yeah.
I mean, I know, Dave, you've worked with a lot of customers. Have you seen stuff like this?
This is literally the same customer. And
I mean, Dave Birmingham.
Oh yeah. Too many Daves.
No, I'm not just doing the same stuff that you guys are doing, going in and trying to fix problems. Working for a vendor, I'm here trying to, listen to your requirements. What are you trying to do? And then propose solutions and, help them get to the point where they're comfortable with it. So I don't have the same experiences that all you have in terms of trying to unravel hairy problems that customers are running into. So unfortunately or fortunately for me, I'm not doing those 24-hour days. I wrap things up here in the office and enjoy my downtime.
I think one of the things that kind of scares me about this is, I have that kind of half, don't finish, I was going to say, I have a questionable reproduction of it that I think might reflect what's going on, but I'm just guessing, so we can kind of make it happen on demand in the lab and do all kinds of crazy configuration things and see if it helps or hurts. But at the end of the day, I'm just kind of guessing that this is what's happening in the client systems.
Yeah.
Because in reality, if you want to test it in the wild, it's like you have to wait for patching window, which is like every 3 months. And then
and the other thing I'll tell you is to make sure your cluster logging level, because you're seeing this frequently, is at 5, not 3, the default.
It's probably default, actually.
It's probably default because the default's so verbose.
You will get much more information. I will tell you that is it's the verbose level of logging, and it will give you like everything. But you will see like it will go into the weird network stuff, and it might point you in a direction.
We'll set that before they do patching. I will.
I was thinking, Alan, can you request verbose logging just when you do get cluster log, or do you have to configure it ahead of time?
It's set. I think it's set off the top of my head. Set dash cluster log, whatever.
But you have to set it ahead of time. You can't just do it when you pull.
No. If you've done it after, it's too late.
Okay.
like get it in place now.
Yeah.
And then you can generate out the cluster logs around that time just to see what's going on. But like you'll see, like for example, like when it goes into re-ups in AD the object, if you're doing the VCO that way, like you'll see all that communication that in excruciating detail that isn't there with a cluster log level of 3. And fortunately or unfortunately, in a lot of my customers to diagnose issues, we've had to set it to 5.
We'll crank it up for this next patching cycle. And I'll make sure they've got it's a really good idea. It gives us something to go with, because Rick and I have been troubleshooting this for quite some time now. And it's so fascinating that it's quite literally isolated to one availability group pair there. And they've got 2 sets of them, 2 different sets of machines. And one of them is fine and the other one is different. And it's very odd.
That's why I point to either configuration issue or something just specifically targeting those systems unintentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, Alan Morehouse put something in the chat. Quote, dumb Alan questions is greater than John's smartest questions.
I wouldn't go that far, John. You are very smart.
Yeah, actually, I involuntarily laughed when I saw that, so I hope people don't think I was smirking at an inappropriate moment, like 5 or 10 minutes ago.
That's good. Edwin's got a question about immutable infrastructures and HA implementations. Edwin, you want to pop up and talk through that? Nope, he may have stepped away.
Yeah, I think you did.
Yeah, we'll give him a moment here. But no, that's good. Thank you for the details on that. We'll crank that up and see what we can see. Yeah, Rick's right. We've been trying to reproduce it in the lab, and Rick found the wiffle bat approach to sting it, but we don't know if we're hitting the right spot.
It gives us the symptom, but we don't really know it's the same root cause. Yeah, and we at one point I thought you could help it by turning off dynamic quorum. That might help, but it certainly doesn't fix it. I thought the cluster host on the primary religiously would help. Seemed to fix it for a while, but we just saw that that's not 100%. That's maybe more like a 90%.
I'm gonna also throw out an ugly solution at you too. You said this is enterprise, so this will work. As we all know, sometimes they're just ghosts in the machine that you can't find. Like, so over time, like add a third replica in, sunset one of them, and then add a fourth one in and sunset the other, so that you get rid of those configurations and you eliminate the ghost in the machine. Obviously that's becomes a resource issue. There's no free lunch on this. But if you can basically roll one in, roll one out, and then it becomes stable, you just chalk it up to, look, as consultants, I get the whole making money thing, but at some point you just want to solve the solution, have the solution. Sometimes it's literally just rebuilding the sucker, right? Yeah. And if it gets stable after that, you just chalk it up to whatever.
So, I've never felt comfortable floating this, but there's also the nuclear option of, given that part of the problem is that the file share witness doesn't have the complete geometry of the cluster, of just putting in a third, even if it's not an AG, just putting out a third node in the cluster.
No, don't do that. That is, node as quorum/witness is not a thing. Do not do that. So I would also, is the file share witness in the same place as the other one for the other cluster that's working?
Yes,
probably.
Okay, they're both different shares on the same destination.
Okay, then I'm trying to eliminate that as because I've seen weird things if somebody tries to put it on like an SMB1 share which is not supported or something weird. Yeah. But most people are using SMB3, and it's not on NFS, which would cause issues.
Nope, standard tiny Windows machine running off to the side, nothing fancy.
Yeah, so it sounds to me it said at some point I would just say, we've spent enough time trying to troubleshoot this. Let's roll in new configurations, and because the best part about an AG is you can roll those replicas in, roll the other ones out with basically no downtime. And if you're just stable after that and the problem goes away, yeah, root cause is nice, but at some point you just want to be stable and running.
Yeah.
Like you just chalk it up to bad configuration.
I don't think they'll be opposed to it if we bring it up.
I'd say that would be last resort, but I'd say give it one more go, but if you still see it, present that as an option.
We've got patching in 2.5 weeks. I'll bring it up then no matter what. If we see this again, I'm gonna suggest it to them. And they're pretty reasonable. I think they'll agree to it.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to be kind of a jerk about it, but at some point you spend so many hours looking at something, it's like, it's got to be here. And then somebody's like, well, would it be just take a couple hours, rebuild this stuff, and just be done with it?
They're reasonable. That's not being a jerk. That's not being anything weird. I think it's a reasonable approach, to be honest.
Yeah,
it's just being pragmatic.
It's not like you're.
Yeah, the reason it hasn't been more aggressive with us is that they only patch about every 3 to 6 months, and it hits maybe every other time they patch. So it's just been this little thorn in the side for a while.
It looks like Edwin's back.
Yeah, Edwin, you want to ask your question about immutable infrastructures and HA implementations?
Trying to get my audio. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so with all the DevOps thing, all the CI/CD thing with SQL Server and trying to get that into the concept of immutable infrastructures. I'm seeing customers trying to implement stuff like Kubernetes and making it highly available. I'm not talking about SQL Server or any databases for that matter, but just incorporating that into like HA implementation and business continuity. Has anybody seen like in new practices around that? I try to keep SQL Server as highly available using the traditional means as well. But I just want to hear what your thoughts are when it comes to implementing some form of like deploying immutable infrastructures and making it highly available.
I definitely want to hear Anthony's answer here.
Oh, geez. So back in the consulting days, that was always the desire, right? And I think, especially in the Microsoft space, it's hard to get to because, 5 years ago, that tooling wasn't there. And then like things like DSC came out, which that was the concept behind DSC. I have this config. I want this config to be affected all the time. And we all know and love DSC and use it successfully to this day, correct? Awkward long pause for a reason. Right. Exactly. And not to disparage the tech, but it just didn't catch on in our universe. But I had customers in the consulting, especially the Linux shops, that were doing this even outside of the Kubernetes space, right? CI/CD, automated system deployment, cloud formation in AWS, ARM templates in Azure, right? And that's all stuff that's becoming more commonplace now. And I think it's a shift in our universe of things that we have visibility into. It's going in that direction because we're in some respects, we're our group of data professionals is behind the curve a little bit when it comes to automation and tooling and automated rollouts and things like that. And we're finally catching up, right? And so what I'd hope to see as we move forward, that continue to be the case. And yeah, like is Kubernetes catching on in SQL Server? Yeah, not so much. But the ideas behind Kubernetes are really the value. I write code, I affect that change and do the thing, right? And hopefully that continues to gain traction in our universe. But when customers building non-stateful applications, I saw that all day, right? I have code, CI/CD, I can roll it out in a Kubernetes cluster and do a thing. In fact, change, we were talking earlier about rollbacks, right? How hard is the rollback after an upgrade? In the Kubernetes space, it's extremely simple, right? Because of container images and so on. And so we have the tools, but our world, our problem domain isn't leveraging those tools that so much yet, right? That was either really good or really bad. I either dropped the mic or y'all just stopped listening like 5 minutes ago.
I'm just letting other people chime in. I'm sick of hearing me talk.
Yeah.
Like, what are y'all seeing? Because I have, like, that's my view is, what I've been able to see. Is anyone else seeing the same things, different things? What are y'all experiences there?
That was a subtle Anthony question, by the way. No, what I'm seeing is because the developers are pushing the infrastructure guys with deployments on their application stack, but then DBAs are not aware, there's something that we can do with this, especially with the adoption of SQL Server on Linux, and then putting that on Docker containers. There's still a bit of a pushback on the implementation side, plus the whole HA story about putting SQL Server on Linux on HA or Kubernetes, and then it's just a totally different story when it comes to managing it, configuring it. You're gonna waste a lot of time trying to just make it work. Versus with apps, it's just pretty straightforward. And I just want to get a sense of what everybody else is seeing out in the field, because a lot of my customers are embracing it from the app side, but not on the SQL Server side.
Well, I would expand that out to say infrastructure as a whole, because for better or worse, and I've said this for a while too, we've raised a generation or two of infrastructure people on the Windows side. I'm not going to talk about Linux, who are used to GUIs. Period. That was the whole point. Windows was easy to manage, right? So, we can get into how good or bad some of Microsoft's own tools are around that, and I'm not just leave that alone right now. But so when Windows Server Core was introduced in 2008, it wasn't supported with SQL Server. I was actually doing some work for Microsoft at the time and testing it, and I didn't even know that wasn't supported. Just because .NET stuff wasn't in there, because it was supposed to be totally secure and whatever. They wanted to make it more Linux-like. Well, over time, they made it so that SQL Server could work on server core, and you'd think that would work into this DevOps world, right? You could use SQL Server stuff like scripting to deploy it. And I could tell you, I had one customer in the past 15 years implement server core, and they quickly backed away from it. Literally. And it's not anecdotal evidence. It's literally nobody does it, because I literally had a very large company you've heard of say to me, my administrators will break these boxes, therefore we will never deploy server core. That's a huge friggin' deal, right? So we, in the Windows world, there's this mindset, no GUI is bad and scripting is evil. How many people, I know that in our end of the world, because of VBA tools, which is awesome, PowerShell has had a lot of adoption in the SQL Server community. But as a whole, I don't see a lot of PowerShell adoption by Windows admins. I see it in pockets. I don't see it as a universal rule. Whereas the Linux world, scripting is it, obviously. The GUIs are like afterthoughts, and stuff like Ansible and Chocolatey and all that stuff is just part of daily whatever. Whereas in the Windows world, that stuff is painful, largely. And that's the problem. I think, and then we get into abstractions around availability where you can't do an end-to-end story automated for an FCI. You just can't.
Yeah.
You can do partially automated with AGs if there's no shared storage, but it's still painful. So you can't have HA solutions in the traditional non-Kubernetes SQL Server world without some form of manual intervention, even if it's all scripts. So that doesn't fit nicely into a DevOps model. It just doesn't right now. And it has to get better. It's just not, I don't know if that's anybody else's experience, but that's mine.
I'm with you. That really mirrors everything that I see. I've got 2 shops in the last 10 years that went Windows Core, and I ask a very basic question. If the poop hits a fan, can you admin this machine from memory, not from Google, with all the commands you need to get this thing diagnosed and back up and running? And they had a couple of people there that could at both shops. And for that, I give them a lot of kudos. Nobody else can that I've seen. Not transparently without Googling for commands.
So I was running, it wasn't called Windows Server Core back then. It was just Windows Server on Itanium, but it's basically Windows Server Core because Microsoft only ported like half the tools over to the Itanium world. So everything command line was working, everything non-command line was pretty much not working. Yeah, you couldn't even run SQL Management Studio on these boxes. Yeah, but SQL was running awesomely on it. Yeah, so and what we had to do is we had this little head in our DBA room where every morning every DBA coming in had to pull out a little chip, and if they picked the wrong color, that meant the whole day they had to work with SQL CMD and command prompt and nothing else, just to stay used. If the GUIs is not there, and if they have to go in the data center and connect to that server, that's all they're gonna have, and they need to be able to run it. Yeah, it's once you get used to it, you can do it. But I agree. Every other company I worked for since then, the Windows team, no. You take the mouse away from them, they can't do anything. Yeah. And yeah. What I see more and more is that companies want deployment and automated. So they don't want to have people use the mouse to install the machines anymore. But once they're installed, they are perfectly fine of letting them ruin them with the mouse again. So
I think part of this goes back to working conditions. I mean, I do lots of command line and scripting stuff. I'm a consultant. If I'm on unfamiliar hardware and I don't have the toys I'm used to working with, I don't want to feel restricted. So I put in time to get good at that. if I was an FTE at a company on an exempt status, so I was getting paid for nominally 40 hours a week, but working 60, I wouldn't be looking for stuff to do unless I was forced to. And I think that might be a lot of what's driving the GUI centric stuff.
Well, I think it's even further than that. It's sort of some of what we talked about before. They don't have the time. It's not even looking. It's just they're barely keeping their heads above water. It's keeping the systems up and running and performing to the best that they can. They can't go sit down and spend hours debugging a script to go automate everything, right? And I think that's the hard part of all this is I don't think it's a desire not to want to do it and make their lives easier. I think it's quite simply they just don't have the time.
To keep your boss off your back, you're already doing 60 hours. You don't want to get in your sleep schedule to learn how to script.
Yeah,
right? I should stop saying you don't want to, but you just simply can't if you want to see your family.
Well, and hate to say, at some point you're not compensated enough to do all that extra work, and I'm not even going to be like blunt about it. Like that's just the truth. Like at some point, you're doing all this extra work for nothing else.
That's actually the only reason I don't look at W2 work anymore. I don't even consider it because that's kind of the way it always is.
I'd say consultants have shades of that, but that's a discussion for a different time. It's not necessarily more manageable as a consultant either. I think it's different trade-offs and different.
Yeah.
Now that I'm on the other side of the coin again, I sort of have a weird perspective because it's fresh, and I would just say it's not bad. It's just different.
Yeah, no, it definitely has different trade-offs. I remember vividly when I left traditional office work, it was absolutely looking back, realizing I'd worked an average of 60 hours a week, including factoring in holidays, including factoring in the weeks I was on vacation, which meant the weeks I was at the office were completely horrendous. And it's like it's different being self-employed. Not necessarily better, but there's at least a sense of control, I guess.
So here's something to throw out to the group. It's a debate I've been a part of at a few clients over the years. If you're saying that a team needs to be 24/7 on call, and let's just for argument's sake say the response time is an hour or two, let's say an hour. What, in your experience, do you think is kind of the magic number where that's reasonable, or below that the team, or if it's just one or two people, should say, okay, we're on call, but you should compensate us or flex time or whatever? Is there any almost like happy medium where you've seen it work, where you think it's a reasonable request, whether over, less than that, like people should be compensated for it?
Personal opinion here. I've been in that role a lot over the years. I would say if you're on call for a week at a time, no more than 1 week of every month, and there's got to be some sort of compensation on top of that, and some flexibility to change that schedule if it's going to fall on family events. For example, my last job, the schedule was inflexible, and I ended up being on call for every major holiday for 3 years straight, and the calendar would not budge, and that was not very fun.
Yeah.
My last job, you had to be within 5 minutes of your computer.
Yep, I've been there, done that. That's kind of why I'm asking this, because that's not right. That's sometimes physically impossible.
Yeah, I see John shaking his head.
And nobody would cover. They said they would be flexible and watch us so you could go to the grocery store. They didn't do that to me.
Right.
And they drove me insane. Literally. That's why I don't have that job anymore, because and we were on call for 2 weeks at a time.
Ooh. And
then we were like the backup on call for the next person for 2 weeks at a time. So you're on call half the year, basically. Because what do you do if that person's not, basically you got to be 5 minutes away for that person, but they said you didn't, but you really had to be.
Right.
Just in case the other person didn't answer.
Yeah, I think.
The question is not just how long you're on call, it's also how bad is being on call. If on call means You have 1 week on call and you might get 1 or 2 calls at a reasonable time when it's like 10 p.m. or 6 a.m. or something in the morning. Or are you getting every 20 minutes a call around the clock? Yeah. So that makes a big difference of how many people you need to sustain that. Yeah.
It was
There
random
also
all day
needs to-
long. You got paged at least a few times a day
And
for my that job. I only did it from like July until May because I had a
Going to
position
be-
at this company prior to that where it wasn't so bad. So I went to this team thinking it wasn't going to be as it was going to be like the other team, and I never got paged on the other team. So being 5 minutes away from the computer for a week at a time over there wasn't as bad. So I was like, oh, it won't be bad over there. They neglected to tell me they actually get paged all the time for stupid stuff. Like they got paged for stuff that you shouldn't get paged for. But
if it's
you had to
multiple per day,
respond to it, and you had to put in chats. You had to research like why the CPU hit 80% for like 2 seconds, maybe 5 seconds. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It would spike up and it would flip off Century 1, and you had to go tell it that this particular query that ran every day at that time ran. I was nice.
If it's
I fixed that
multiple-
query for them, by the way, the one that ran every day during lunchtime before I left during my last couple of weeks.
if it's
They
multiple
wouldn't let me do
calls-
that in July, but I kind of cheated and did it before I left. I wasn't supposed
if
to.
it's multiple calls per day for the on-call people, that's not on-call anymore. That's called a 3-shift operation per day.
Right.
And you need at least 5 people to cover that per week.
We had 4 people on our team, and that was it. So that's why we did like basically rotate every month.
Yeah, 4 seems like it's kind of the bare minimum, but right, if you're responding to multiple incidents a day, I've been there, done that. It grinds you down, and you're right. At that point, you need to either talk about third shift people on the team, or perhaps offshore, near shore, something like that. Somebody. Now, the quality of support is not likely to be as good, but it keeps your people upright and healthy.
You have a layer 1 in there, yeah. That the guy that just clicks on retry on some job or something, yeah. That you can put in, and then so in my case, I'm on call at layer 3. So there's an L1 team that gets the page, gets the alert, and has a run book and follows it. If they can't succeed, they call the L2 guy. That's the guy that in 99.9% of the cases fixes it. And if this guy has an issue, can't work with it, then the call will come to me. Yeah. So I'm in that role on call 24/7, 365 days a year. Yeah. And I don't mind. I get like 2, maybe 3 calls a year. Yeah. Do they always come to the worst time? Of course. Yeah.
So it always happens when you're just sitting there and be like, wow, I have nothing to do right now. And then the phone rings, right? And then you've got something to do. It's always how it's worked for me.
Exactly. No, it's more like, yeah, that movie that I waited for 6 years to see it finally is now starting, and I'm walking out of the theater after standing in line for 3 hours. No, it's fine. So that is doable. Yeah. But as Tracy said, if you get called around the clock and one after the other, at some point you start making mistakes. Yeah. You can be the best one. If you're sleep deprived, it doesn't work. I mean, it's not a secret that I'm originally from Europe, and Europe has some much, let's say, more friendly labor laws than the United States. And some countries in Europe are even worse, considering that. So we had a subsidiary in Sweden, and the laws there was, if someone was on call and got a call, they immediately got the next day off as a comp day. So if you always needed an extra person on call just in case the first one was called, because then you needed the second one to cover the next day. Yeah. So that was tough. Yeah, because you needed a lot of people to be on call there.
Well, so funny, not funny. That story I was telling about that company from 20 years ago, they realized that very quickly because, when somebody's sort of down and out, like there's one day I literally spent 36 hours awake on site. And they kind of realized they needed to backfill, and it's like, who's going to do that? I can't be awake 24/7 every day for weeks on end, right? And it doesn't matter that they were paying me as a consultant, although it's working for a consulting company, so the company was making the money, I was not making the money. But you realize very quickly the staffing level matters here, because like in Tracy's case, like if you only have 2 or 3 people to cover a month, everybody's screwed for basically half or a third of the year. But not everybody can have a team of 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Or have a different levels of, like, when you get to this point, we're like DEFCON 11, like it's like really bad. And it's just, that's how you lose people, because people are like, I'm out, I can't deal with this 24/7 situation. And like I could say, just on the flip side, as a consultant, like the SQL HA model really wasn't to provide 24/7 support in the truest sense of the word. Like, we didn't do managed services in the way that most people did, right? But if our customer emailed us at 10 o'clock at night, one of us was generally up and looking, so we would handle it, right? Because we cared about our customers. It wasn't a thing that people abused either, right? But it was a kind of thing like we were there for our customers, and we had that commitment to them, and we wanted to help them. It wasn't like traditional managed services where you're just on the hook, right? And luckily we didn't have a ton of those, but we got those, right? And we didn't grouse about it. If we were around, we just rolled up our sleeves, helped our customers, and moved on, right? And people appreciate that, whereas if it becomes an expectation that you're just 24/7, you're like the paint on the wall, like you're just, that's where it becomes a huge problem. And they don't see it as special. It's just, and that's not, and I just think of just life, like Tracy, if you can't spend 5 minutes to go to the grocery store, that's a problem. You just, quality of life is a real big issue when you have lots of availability outages. And when it happens months on end, as I've experienced in the past with certain customers, it's exhausting for everyone. And you have to plan for that. You just do.
When your team becomes more firefighter than fire brigade than actual solving problems.
Yep.
You couldn't get any work done. You just
Yeah.
couldn't. I mean,
Yeah.
you got work done, but it was only like when you weren't on call and stuff, and it was just, and the stuff you responded to weren't real alerts that you had to do anything with.
Yeah. Well, and that's
every now and then you had an alert you had to do something with, but you were so used to not having to like do real fixes for alerts that you're just like, oh, it's just another, and then, oh crap, there's actually something going on.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you're just exhausted. I mean, trust me, I was out of work for 3 months. That's how bad it was. I had to take medical leave.
Yeah.
It was a heavy contributor to a 3-month outage of Tracy.
I was on a team of 4 or 5 people, and we were on 4 or 5 different fires separately. And people asking why work wasn't getting done. It's like, well, I spent 8 hours on this problem. They spent 8 hours on another problem. This person just spent 12 hours fixing a different problem. So
John put
senior people.
Yeah, John put an interesting comment in the chat because he doesn't want to get on the microphone, I guess. But
I've got one.
Yeah, but I think what you said there is true, because, and I think we can speak to this both as FTEs, vendors, and consultants. Mm-hmm. If you're not proactive, you're always in a reactive mode, and that's the firefighting mode, right? And when you have these outages and these events, that you have to then learn from them, do postmortems, and put things in place, be it monitoring, script, whatever it is, to mitigate that so that one problem you encountered maybe doesn't happen in the same way, or the impact is less. And over time, these events get less chaotic, right? Like, if you know every time the CPU spikes to this, then these 3 things happen, you need to be alerted when it's happening at 40 or 45%, not when it hits that. It's too late, right?
Yep.
So when do you need to be notified before to stop the bad chain of events? Like, we've had customers in the past where we knew certain conditions hit in their applications where as long as we were alerted on them, we could prevent them. But you have to know and be smart about your monitoring. So a big part, to tie it up, because this is about business continuity, a big part of business continuity and availability is predictability. And there's going to be the oh crap unplanned events. But for stuff you know about, you can prevent those. But then it goes back to, do you have the time to do the coding or put the stuff in the monitoring tool? Because you're spending so much time doing all the other stuff and putting out the fires. It lather, rinse, repeat. So we can only become our own worst enemies or best friends if we can prevent this stuff by being proactive. And that saves half of the downtime at some point. You know, because really what we should be doing is planning for the unplanned stuff, and the planned stuff should sort of be known. Like, it shouldn't be a surprise when your disk fills up and the T-log stops and your AG barfs. Like, literally. 100% preventable situation that we all know about, but how many times have all of us seen stuff like that?
Too many.
Like, we need to stop doing stupid things. And it's not us as consultants, and we are inherently not stupid people. We just have so much other stuff going on, or it's not our responsibility, like as a consultant, we can't force customers to do things. Or as vendors, we can't force them to do the right best practice. If they're going to march down a path, what can we do?
Advise and document. And that's about as far as you can go.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually ran into one company, and I was never sure if I was impressed by this or disturbed by it. It's a smaller shop, but they had one person on staff whose full-time job was fighting fires. So on one hand, it's kind of cool in a way because, you know, they could document the cost of these fires happening constantly because, you know, there's this FTE that could be doing something different, you know, to derive revenue if they weren't constantly fighting fires. But I think I also felt by like having someone dedicated to that, it felt like kind of threw in the towel. Yeah, and we're accepting being reactive to at least that level.
How frequently the person in that role quit?
Yeah.
Never quit. Like the entire time. As far as I know, he's still with the company. It's probably VP by now. I don't know if he's still the designated firefighter, but
that person is a masochist if I've ever seen one, by definition.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we're at 2 hours. That was fun. Thank you all for joining. I wish we had some more folks join, but we'll get the recording out here pretty soon. Hopefully we can generate some more buzz around doing one of these again, maybe over the summer sometime. And yeah, I just want to say thank you all for joining. This is fun. I'd love to do more of these kind of things, but I know we're all always pressed for time, so it's a little more difficult.
Yep.
I actually have to go join an emergency call.
Have fun, John.
Have fun.
All right, guys.
Databases are in recovery mode.
Good luck.
Take care, everybody.
Better, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Thanks a lot.